Dan Barker, not a great scholar. He was a teenage evangelist at the age of 15. He worked for the faith healer Catherine Kuhlman. He held pastorates in 3 different churches, a Quaker church, an Assembly of God church, and a charismatic church. And then in 1984, he announced his deconversion on the Oprah Winfrey show. I mean, if you're going to do it big, right? If you're going to capitalize on this, at least get millions of people to be watching while you do it. He's got a development hypothesis. Here's how he puts it in an essay that he wrote back in 2003. When we look at the documents of the resurrection of Jesus, so we're going to focus on the resurrection accounts, we see that the earliest accounts are very simple. Later retellings are more complex, and the latest tales are fantastic. In other words, they look exactly like a legend. Now, there's another version of our developmental hypothesis, this trajectory running through it. Okay, so let's see. Is that true? Here's how he orders the events. He says the first account that we have of the resurrection is 1 Corinthians 15. Full points to him for noticing that. Good. And then Mark, Matthew, then Luke, then John. Okay, it's a very common ordering of the Gospels, probably the one that would be endorsed by most scholars today. There are dissenters, but let's go with it. Let's take this as the order. So here's how he goes about doing his counting. He says the number of extraordinary events in the resurrection stories increases over time. Now, he's setting aside the resurrection of Jesus. So this is other extraordinary stuff happening with that. And so here's his claim. 1 Corinthians 15, 0 additional extraordinary events. You might think that Jesus appearing to various people would count as its own kind of extraordinary event. For the case of 1 Corinthians 15, it doesn't. He's not altogether consistent with that, as we will see. In Mark, there's one. There's this guy in a white garment at the tomb. Let's accept that it's an angel. But then, okay, there's an angel. That's one extraordinary thing in Mark. But in Matthew, there are 4 extraordinary events. And in Luke, there are 5. And then, when you get to John, he says there are at least 8. Now, one of the beautiful things about numbers is that they are very easy to line up, and people see that pattern. I know all about putting numbers in front of people because I am chairman of my department. And so when I talk to higher administration, I know they want numbers. Numbers they understand. Complicated explanations about things that they don't understand don't go very far, but numbers they get. So here, Barker is giving us just what we are wired to look for. Numbers. Right? 0 is less than 1. That's less than 4. That's less than 5. And then that's less than some number that is 8 or greater. Okay. Obvious question. Where did those numbers come from? How exactly did he get those numbers? Let's dig a little bit. Here's what he says. First, appearances of the risen Jesus don't count, because otherwise Paul lists a bunch of them in 1 Corinthians 15, except that they do count if we're looking at Luke. You might see a small problem emerging here. We'll have some fun with that in a minute. The length and purpose of the passage don't count. Has it occurred to anyone that 1 Corinthians 15 does not give us a resurrection narrative? That's not the kind of piece it is, right? We have a creed there, not a narrative of events. Hey, well, why worry about that? We're just lining them up. The length of the passage, the purpose of the passage, those don't count. Here's what Barker says about 1 Corinthians 15. Notice how simple it is, this earliest resurrection story. No angelic messages, no mourning women, no earthquakes, no miracles, no spectacular bodily ascension into the clouds. Anybody here like the Lutheran satire videos? Yeah, I think Dan needs to meet Donald and Connell. Well, now, Patrick, tell us more about how it's not miraculous for Jesus to be rising from the dead. Yeah, we definitely need that. All right, so just, Hans, do it. Make it happen. All right. But there's more. There's more to be said about how he counts extraordinary events. The completeness or incompleteness of the document doesn't count. It's a very live issue whether the ending of Mark, at Mark chapter 16, verse 8, where the oldest manuscripts that we have end it, it indicates that the account is incomplete. Bruce Metzger thought that that was the most likely explanation. Well, now, if you're comparing two accounts, you don't compare a complete account with an incomplete one without mentioning that fact, unless you're Dan Barker, and then you don't mention that fact, and you don't hesitate to compare a complete one to an arguably incomplete document when you're doing accounting. Oh, but there's more. There's more fun. Appearance of Jesus do apparently count, if we want to count them. So, how do we get 5 extraordinary events in Luke? Well, there's 2 angels at the tomb. Those are 2 extraordinary events. Okay? And then, Jesus' appearance to the assembled disciples counts as another extraordinary event. Okay, so it counts if we need it to count to jack up the numbers, and it doesn't if we need it not to depress the numbers. This is getting interesting. I think we can see real potential for using this method of counting. How about if we, just to give ourselves a little bit more room to maneuver here, we're going to count events that aren't narrated. Does that sound fair? I mean, if we need to, let's do it. So, John 20, verse 30 says, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples which are not written in this book." Well, what are those? Are those even post-resurrection, or are those just other signs he did during his ministry? There's actually a scholarly debate, and there has been for a long time over that question. But Barker gets 3 of his events out of that because it's many other, and 2 wouldn't be many, so we kind of count. Yeah, that's 3 or more. That's creative. I like the way this guy thinks. I'm going to use that with the IRS and see how far it gets me. But that's just events that are alluded to and not narrated. How about if we do events that aren't even narrated at all? Would that be cool? I mean, think of the possibilities here. So here's what he tells us. John's resurrection story, this is a direct quotation, has real angels, bodily appearances, including a now you see him manifestation through shut doors, the fish story miracle, and an ascension. An ascension in John. Really? This is a textual discovery of the first order. We definitely need to see this. I was unaware that there was an ascension of Jesus in the Gospel of John. That's really cool. I love it. Yeah, let's just count stuff that isn't there because we can. So, what if we applied his criteria in a different way? We could get the following Barker count. Let's see. If we don't allow things that aren't in the text at all, and if we don't allow things that are alluded to that might not even be relevant to how he's counting, then I say we give John 3, because I'm not going to double count the angels. That's going to pull Luke down to 2. Matthew will still have 4. Mark's going to have 1. And I get to count appearances, right? So 1 Corinthians 15 is going to have 345. It's, 500 people at once, of whom most are now living using Barker's method. I'm going to say that's 251. And okay, and if you happen to go back through this and say, wait a minute, you're not applying your criteria consistently even to get these numbers, I'm going to say, well, I'm just doing it like Dan is doing it. So, yeah, all right. By this kind of reckoning, the story of Jesus' resurrection has clearly diminished in the telling. I am not actually arguing that it's diminished in the telling. I am arguing that this is a thoroughly bogus way to go about trying to read the Gospels. Please,